Hello everyone, and welcome to our discussion this week, which is going to center on instructional systems design. That's what ISD stands for. That's a common abbreviation. You also see ID, instructional design. But as you know from our discussion about histories, instructional design came out of a systems approach, this idea that you would design instruction and take into account the whole system as you would do that, and all the interlocking players and stakeholders. And that's one thing that makes our field a little bit unique is our history, and maybe you could say ability, or at least emphasis on this idea of a systemic approach and all the interlocking pieces of what helps someone be able to learn and someone to be able to teach. So we're going to learn a little bit about some of the more common instructional systems design models this week, and as is the case with our class every week, we will not be spending a great deal of time on any particular model, but at least becoming familiar with some of the terms, some of the basic ideas, so that you can learn more about it in your other classes. First, let's do a little quiz. Fill in the boxes. All right, that's a little easy. We've seen that. I think it's funny. You can go into a Sunday school class, just start drawing circles, and immediately everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. And it's nice because the reason we do this, even though it's a little bit cliched, is because it immediately gives everyone a frame of reference for what we're talking about. We draw the circles and then say, okay, we're talking about the spirit world, and immediately everyone knows what we're talking about in regards to that and how this little part of the model fits into the bigger picture. So here's another fill in the box. What is this? Sorry, the line's a little crooked. And of course you would guess the typical ADDIE model. A stands for analysis, design, development, implementation of the instruction, and then evaluating the instruction to see how well you've done, and then if needed, cycling back and doing some redesign if you need to, and some redevelopment. Now this is very basic example of a model. And as I think we talked about in class, and many of you know, this is not unique to our field either. This is a basic development model for engineers, for software developers, for pretty much anyone that goes through a process of design. They'll go through something similar to this. But there's different ways of looking at this that emphasize various different aspects of this. I'll show you some examples here. So while this is maybe a simplified version of the ADDIE model, in reality, if you look at the textbooks, ADDIE looks more like something like this. This is the famous Dick, Carey, and Carey model, which is perhaps the most famous of the traditional in kind of historical approaches to instructional design. You can see the same kinds of basic boxes, but quite a few more additional boxes. Or it can look like this, where maybe there's all of these, but then there's all these kind of sub-processes that you need to do underneath all of this. Or in some of the more recent approaches to ADDIE, ADDIE doesn't really look like a set of boxes at all. It just looks like some circles. And the reason for this is the Morrison, Ross, and Kemp model, and they've written a textbook that's pretty well received in the field about this. The reason for this is because sometimes the boxes, when they're all lined up in a row, people think they have to go through it step by step. And one of the weaknesses that people have argued against the ADDIE model is that people do go step by step, and it's not a step-by-step process. Design is very much kind of a holistic, cyclical kind of process. And that's what Morrison, Ross, and Kemp are trying to portray here, that there are things that have to happen, but they happen in relationship to each other and not necessarily in a linear way. And that something like evaluation is happening throughout the process and overall. This, as I think you learned from the chapter, is from David Merrill. And one thing to know about David Merrill is he was at BYU. He was a faculty member here at BYU back in the day. Then went on to Utah State, spent a great number of time at Utah State, and has moved on and done other things since then. And his model, you look at this, it doesn't look like ADDIE at all. In fact, it looks very different. So this is kind of, there have been some approaches that try to reject ADDIE and try to come up with models for instructional design that are quite a bit different. So with Merrill, the big deal is that everything centers around an authentic problem to be solved. His belief is that learning happens best when you're solving authentic problems. So he's very much a problem-based learning kind of a person. And if we'll be learning more about his instructional theories, and of course one of them is the first principles of design of instruction, And you'll see when you compare the first principles of instruction with this design model that they go hand in hand. And that's an interesting approach that maybe is kind of getting more common nowadays, to have models of design that are also based on learning theories. So if you have a theoretical approach that you believe is the right way to go about teaching in a particular context, then have a design model that is based on that theoretical approach. Here with Merrill, you progress out from having an authentic problem to solve to looking at the progression of smaller tasks to solve that problem, and then analyzing how you would teach someone to solve those tasks and your strategy for teaching that, designing it, and then actually producing the design. And then there's actually another circle that he's added since then, which is evaluating the design that you do. This is a model that is geared more for teachers. So instead of being systemic in its approach, this is more designed for a teacher in a classroom, and trying to help teachers know a little bit about what we know as instructional designers and give them tools to make informed and really logical decisions about how they go about their teaching. So this comes from Dr. Sharon Smaldino and some of her colleagues, Debbie Lothar and others. And so Sharon Smaldino is a former past president of AACT, and really a wonderful person to know, and you'll probably get to meet her if you go to AACT. And so her model looks very similar to an ADDIE type approach, but you can see some of the lingo, and it's looking very much at teachers in a classroom making decisions to help their students. And then many times there have been people in our field who come from a more product development background, and so they emphasize more of a rapid prototyping type of approach, which is just very much that you start building immediately. So instead of doing this huge, long analysis of the learners and their needs, which is kind of the more traditional approach in instructional design, that you do this analysis of tasks that need to be done, analysis of knowledge that needs to be done and needs to be had, and all these kinds of things. Instead, you do a very kind of initial analysis, very brief, and then immediately build something, design it, and build an actual prototype, and start using the prototype. And while the prototype is being used, you continue to analyze your learners and evaluate the prototype and see what's working and what's not working, kind of in real time. So this would be an example from ETR&D that was published. So you start off analyzing the needs, and immediately start building and utilizing. Immediately after building, you start utilizing the prototype, and while utilizing the prototype, you're continuing to analyze, you're starting to build the system, and your objectives. See, this is a little bit backwards. Instead of setting your objectives first, you start to develop your objectives as you're watching the prototype being used and understanding what it can be used for and in what kinds of ways. So kind of a more rapid prototyping, maybe a beta testing kind of approach. And then, of course, here in our department, we've got Andy Gibbons, who has an architectural approach to instructional design, and he has a new textbook that's come out, and also a chapter that you can read in the Green Book. And his basic idea is that there are different layers to a design, and these layers age at different rates. And you can design these layers to work together, but to also be kind of independent. So you might, for example, design for a particular science content and use a problem-based strategy and have a particular kind of message and a way of having the learner interact with the message. But then, for example, you might build it with some particular kind of media, and then maybe operating systems go out of date, and so you need to update your media. But instead of having to redo the whole design, you say, well, these other layers may still be valid, we just need to update the media layer, or maybe the representation layer, or maybe there's new ways of collecting data, and so we've got a new data layer that we're going to add. But you only to design the layer that you need to design, and so it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it that I think has some good merit as well. And then even there's been people who say, look, if we believe in constructivist types of approaches to learning, what would be an instructional design approach to constructivism? Because most of the traditional approaches to instructional design are more of an instructivist approach, meaning kind of a cognitivist approach that we think we know how to design the instruction in a way that you will be able to learn from it. Kind of a top-down instructor approach to teaching. But there's also the bottom-up approach, which says, well, learners learn in different ways. We just need to provide resources and opportunities for them, and they will then construct their learning themselves. And so this is kind of an approach that hasn't maybe gained a whole lot of traction, but is maybe representative of various different kinds of ways that you could design learning based on a more constructivist kind of theory. So what does this all mean? I've shown you various different models. Some of them you read about in the chapter. It can be a little bit overwhelming. I think we can group some of these models in various different ways, and that's going to be partly the activity that you're going to be working on in groups. But I like this. This comes from Dr. Michael Grant. He's at Memphis, and he has a presentation on instructional design models. The whole presentation is good. He has some quotes from all the various different people who designed the models. You can go look at that if you want to. That'd be good information. He takes this image from Branch and Gustafson, their little book, and I'm going to show you that book here in a minute. But this is an interesting way of kind of looking at the instructional design models. And you'll see, maybe as you've read about it, some of them are more geared towards classroom approaches. Some are more designed for designing a product. And some really are that systemic approach that maybe is the more traditional approach in our field of looking at a whole system. And you can see that these have various strengths and weaknesses. Some require much more money than others. Some are kind of more geared towards an individual approach, where some you really need that kind of team level. Some you need a really high level of instructional design experience. Others you can get a novice involved and start doing it immediately. Some emphasize developing, some emphasize selecting tools that are already existing. Some emphasize analysis more than others, technological complexity, and the amount of revision that you make to the design. You can see sometimes some approaches will design something and then it's really hard to change it later because you've built the thing, you've invested so much money in building the thing that you can't then revise it. And also maybe how you distribute it to other people, how important the marketing of the product is. So you can see that there's pros and cons to all these models. I wouldn't say that any model is necessarily better than the others. I think it depends on the kind of instruction that you're wanting to do and what your resources are. If you want to learn more about instructional design, the way to really go about it is to read something from Robert Branch. I think he wrote the chapter in our textbook, and very well known at University of Georgia, wonderful man too if you ever meet him at ACT. He's really good to know. He's the department chair out there at University of Georgia. And him and Dr. Gustafson wrote a book that was called affectionately the Red Book, because it was red, and it was a survey of instructional design approaches, and I think the most recent one was 2002. So it's starting to age a little bit, and Dr. Gustafson's retired and moved on, and so Robert Branch wrote his own book, and it's a little bit bigger, about the ADDIE approach, where he goes through and talks about how to do ADDIE in the traditional way, and the kinds of analyses that you should do, how to do a task analysis, how to do, you know, all the different kinds of learner analyses that you need to do, and things like that. If you go to instructionaldesign.org, which is a website maintained by Rich Collada, who's an alumni of our department, and he is now in the Office of Education, the Department of Education for the United States. But he has a list on his website of some books on instructional design, and these are all different approaches. So there's going to be the Smith and Reagan approach, there's the Morrison, Ross, and Kemp approach, there's going to be the Dick, Carey, and Carey approach. So various different books on instructional design. Here's a picture actually of Rich, and good friend of mine. We were in the same cohort here at BYU when we were master's students, and a wonderful guy, a great instructional designer. On his website he also has this list of theories, actually design models, so you can actually read here. These are like maybe 2-page summaries of the different models, and you can see not all of them have been filled out yet. I think he's actually looking for people to help fill this out, so if you're interested in maybe getting a little bit of publication credit, he might be interested in letting you help him write up a little summary for these things. But he's trying to create a list of all the basic instructional design models and how you can go about implementing them. So go to the next part of this unit, and I'll explain more the assignment, but in a nutshell what we're going to do, because these different models work for different kinds of settings, I've put you into groups, and the idea is you have a challenge of what you're designing, and you need to decide which design approach is going to be the most appropriate for you, and the important thing is why. Talk about the trade-offs, what's going to be the strengths and weaknesses, talk about how you might modify your design model, because various different companies will modify a model to fit their approach. Maybe you would blend a couple models together, but talk about that and then present to the other groups which model you would use and why, and that will be one of our main activities for this week.